The morning of March 22nd, 1622 breaks with a deceptive, soft warmth along the banks of the James River. In the small, scattered homesteads of the Virginia Company, now 14 years into this harrowing American experiment, the settlers are finally breathing. They've survived the starving time. They've seen the first shipments of tobacco, that brown growing gold, fetch high prices in London, and they believe, with optimism, that they have finally achieved a lasting peace with the Powhatan Confederacy. In the home of George Thorpe at Berkeley Hundred, the scene is one of quiet, civilized domesticity. Thorpe is a man of high stock, a former member of Parliament, and a gentleman of the King's Privy Chamber. He's an idealist, a man who believes the, as he calls them, Indian heathen, can be won over through kindness, education, and the gentle hand of English manners. He's built a proper English house with the great Chief Opechancanough, the brother of Powhatan and uncle of Pocahontas, complete with a lock and key that the chief delights in turning. This morning, Thorpe sits at his table with several Indians. They've come without bows, without war paint, carrying only furs and corn to trade. They sit as guests. They break bread with the English. They smile. They laugh. Then, in a synchronized heartbeat of violence that stretches for 100 miles along the river, the smile vanishes and the slaughter begins. One of the guests reaches for a heavy wooden tool, a tool Thorpe himself provided to teach the Indians the art of English carpentry, and brings it down with a sickening crunch into the skull of his host. Across the tidewater, the story is the same. The guest becomes the executioner. In a single morning, 1/3 of the English population of Virginia is wiped off the face of the earth. Those slain are the ones, largely, who thought they could aid the Indians, who wanted to preach to them, minister to them, help them. They were repaid for that kindness with horrible deaths. Their homesteads burned, their farms are ravaged, their families lie dead. The colony is almost destroyed. This is the story of the 1622 Indian Rebellion. It is the tale of the moment the Virginia Company dream of a society involving the Indians in a prominent way, integrating them into the new English society here in Virginia, dies in a wretched pile of blood. It is the story of how the carnage of 1622's Good Friday forces the survivors to abandon their idealism and embrace instead the scorched earth logic of total war with the Indians, a logic that will define the American frontier for the next 3 centuries. Welcome back to the Old World with Philip Hitler, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventures and magnificent American and British families of the world that used to. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video around if you like it. That's how we grow and keep this project going. Last time we told the tale of Berkeley's rebellion. This time, before picking up with the topping people and their culture, we're going back in time a bit. Tell the story of how Virginia's rough and tumble frontier got the way it was, and how it became so violent, such as with the attacks that precipitated Bacon's rebellion. Such is an integral component of the Virginia story, and explains much about it. So before we pick back up with history and then dive into the first families, we need to tell the full tale of the war along the frontier. So let's dive into how it began. To understand the sheer shock of what happened in 1622, we need to look at what preceded it. Following the marriage of Pocahontas to John Rolfe in 1614, a great adventure of that period, and it was quite a coup for the English settlers. A decade of relative peace settled over the Chesapeake. The English could finally transition from being this military outpost on a wretched frontier to being a sprawling agricultural colony. The tobacco that Rolfe had taught people how to grow and brought with him to Virginia. Remember, as we covered in episode 1, in 1618, the Virginia Company issued what we called the Great Charter. This ended the common store system and established the headright system, granting land to those who could pay their way or pay the way of others, and established the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in the New World. Under the leadership of Governor Sir George Yeardley, the colony expanded rapidly. Plantations were no longer huddled behind the palisade of Jamestown or barely extant little piles of mud and wood in its vicinity. They started spreading out, engrossing the riverfronts, moving miles away from one another in search of the best tobacco soil. This expansion is what led to irrational exuberance regarding the Indians and what might be achieved with men like George Thorpe at this time believed the Powhatan are a people, quote, ripe for conversion, end quote. They invest thousands of pounds into the creation of a university at Henricus for the instruction of Indian youth. They encourage Indians to live in English homes, to learn English trades, and to walk freely through English settlements. This applies because the English are fat with peace. They neglect their fortifications. They allow their muskets to rust. They believe that because they are civilizing the wilderness will naturally submit to their version of the world. But Opechancanough sees a creeping infestation. The brother of the late Powhatan, he's a strategist. He watches as the English headwrights swallow up the sacred hunting grounds and the ancestral cornfields of his people. He sees that the English are no longer just traders, but occupiers. He realizes that this English peace brought with Pocahontas is merely a slow, polite form of the annihilation of his people. So, moving ahead a bit from there, in 1622, which now spent years preparing for the great stroke. He unifies secretly the disparate tribes of the Tidewater and waits for the perfect moment, a moment when the English Guard is at its absolute lowest. And so at exactly 8 a.m. on March 22nd, without a single signal fire or drumbeat to give them away, the Indians move, and the slaughter is terrible. At Martin's Hundred, the largest and most successful settlement outside of Jamestown, the slaughter is horrible and absolute. The Indians enter the homes of the settlers, as they have done 100 times before, sitting down to breakfast or joining them in the fields. Then, using the settlers' own hoes, axes, and knives, they begin the bloody work. Men are cut down in their doorways. Women are slain in their kitchens. Children are smashed to death against the very door frames their fathers had just finished hewing. At Woolston hometown, the center of Martin's Hundred, the town is reduced to a smoking graveyard in less than an hour. 73 people are killed there alone. It's awful. At Berkeley Hundred, George Thorpe's idealism meets its bloody end. The Indians do not just kill him, they mutilate him with a ritualistic fury, as if to mock the very civilization and religion and hopes of peace he tried to impose on them. There will be none of that, just blood. At the university at Henricus, the great hope of the company for civilizing the Indians, it's leveled to the ground. Every teacher, every student, every laborer is put to the hatchet. No Indians will be taught here. Such is the story across the fledgling colony. What had been a thriving one on the verge of becoming as prosperous as had always been dreamt is now back to being a land of action and death. The carnage moves like a scythe down the river. From the falls at Richmond to the mouth of the Chesapeake, the Tidewater is a corridor of fire and screams. In a single morning, 347 settlers, nearly one-third of the entire English population, is slaughtered. A contemporary account describes the attack like this. As in other days before, Indians came unarmed into our houses, without bows or arrows or other weapons, with deer, turkeys, fish, furs, and other provisions to sell and truck with us, with glass beads and other trifles. Yea, in some places sat down to breakfast with our people at their tables, whom immediately, with their own tools and weapons, either laid down or standing in their houses, they basely and barbarously murdered, not sparing either age or sex, man, woman, or child, in their cruel execution, that few or none discerned the weapon or blow that brought them to destruction. In which manner they also slew many of our people then at their several works and husbandries in the fields, and without their houses, some in planting corn and tobacco, some in gardening, some in making brick, building, sawing, and other kinds of husbandry. They, well knowing in what places and quarters each of our men were, in regard to their daily familiarity, and resort to us for trading and other negotiations, which the more willingly was by us continued and cherished for the desire we had of effecting that great masterpiece of works, their conversion. And by this means, that fatal Friday morning there fell 347 men, women, and children, most by their own weapons, and not being content with taking away life alone, they fell again upon the dead, making as well as they could a fresh murder, defacing, dragging, and mangling the dead carcasses into many pieces, in carrying some parts away in derision with base and brutish triumph. End quote. Jamestown itself was saved only by a miracle of individual conscience. A young Indian boy named Chanco, who had been living with and converted by a settler named Pace, is ordered by his brother, a fellow Indian, to kill his master. Instead, Chanco warns Pace in the dead of night. Pace rows frantically across the river to Jamestown, alerting the governor just as the dawn breaks. This proves more successful than when the White Raja was warned of the Kongzi rebellion targeting Kuching 2 centuries later, as we covered a few weeks ago in the series on the White Raja. This time, the warning is heeded. The capital's gates are slammed shut, muskets crying. When the Indians appear before the palisade, expecting to find a sleeping population, they're met with a volley of lead. They retreat into the woods, but damage has been done. The Virginia dream has been decapitated. With it, John Rolfe, whose marriage to Pocahontas brought about the great peace that led to Virginia's growth, probably lies dead with it. He's never heard from again. Hundreds lie dead with him, though none of the black slaves. Virginia will never be the same. The massacre of March 22nd is only the beginning of the catastrophe. In the weeks that follow, the survivors flee their scattered plantations and huddle together in 8 fortified locations, most cluster in Jamestown. They abandon their crops, they abandon their livestock, they abandon that which was making them wealthy and feeding them. The result is a return to the horrors of the starving time. The structural collapse of the colony's agricultural base is as deadly, if not more so, than the Indians' tomahawks. Crowded into unsanitary, cramped forts, the survivors are ravaged by the bloody flux and the burning fever. Disease strikes down those who survive the arrows, tomahawks, and improvised weapons of March 22nd. The Virginia Company in London, already teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, is unable to send relief. The settlers are forced to eat their seed corn just to survive the winter of 1622 to 23. The stock of the colony is dramatically winnowed by hunger and disease. But it is in this crucible of misery that Virginia resurfaces and undergoes a fundamental transformation. The idealism of George Thorpe is replaced by the cold, tactical pragmatism of men like John Martin, Francis Wyatt. They realize they're not on a mission of conversion. They're in a war of survival. They realize that their ideal, their God, cannot be shared with the heathen. Rather, they must defend themselves, do so with a wall of fire. By the spring of 1623, the English moved from a defensive policy to a policy of offensive total war. They abandoned whatever remained of the peace of Pocahontas, now dead when Rolfe brought it out, and instead embraced war to the knife. The settlers a series of fights targeting the Indians by targeting their food supplies. They realize they cannot catch the Indians in the woods, so they target their stomachs. Every summer, just as the Indian corn is ripening, the English launch massive raids. In these raids, they burn the Indian corn crop or the cornfield. They do not seek a decisive battle. They seek to create a systematic famine. They turn the crops the Indians once used to feed them against those same Indians. 1622 must be again. The most chilling moment of this counteroffensive occurs the next year, May 1623. The English invite the Powhatan leaders to a peace parley or negotiate a truce. They offer the Indians wine, spiked with poison. As the Indian leaders fall into convulsions, the English soldiers draw their swords and finish the job, killing dozens of the high-ranking members of the Confederacy. Though Opechancanough miraculously escapes, the leadership is gutted. This is what revenge looks like. The English decided the Indian was a structural impossibility within their society. He cannot be a citizen, he cannot be a brother. He can, as they see it, only be an obstacle, and the deadly one at that. And so they use every tool available. As Virginia Stabney tells it, of his Virginia, the New Dominion, quote, the English, quite understandably, reacted in a fury of revenge. Expeditions against the Indians were organized and carried out ruthlessly. Gone were plans for peaceful relations. Not only were the Redskins slain wherever found, but their villages and crops were destroyed. When the elusive natives could not be overtaken, the colonists concentrated on burning their village and corn. Unquote. War rages for over a decade. This is slow, grinding war of attrition that eventually breaks the back of the Powhatan Confederacy. By 1632, the Indians are pushed back beyond the fall line, that geographic line where the tidewater turns into the Piedmont, and the tidewater is once again open for business, the business of growing tobacco. The 1622 rebellion is the death knell for the already struggling, mismanaged, and multi-broke Virginia Company. When the news of the massacre and the subsequent mismanagement reaches London, King James I has finally had enough. Uses the chaos as a pretext to dissolve the company. 1624. Virginia becomes a royal colony. This is a pivotal moment. The transition from a private company to a crown colony provides the legal stability needed for the colony to grow and the Virginia gentry to develop. Great patents, mercantilist policies, massive amounts of trade, all comes from this moment, really. It is under the king's authority that the cousinage we keep talking about begins to weave its web of power. It'll be a while yet before it's as strong as it can, but it begins here. The governor, now appointed by the king, possesses the seigneurial authority to grant the land patents that will build the great houses of the 18th century. The massacre of 1622 purges the colony of its soft, mercantile idealism. It proves that the New World will always require a sword to protect it. It teaches the Virginians that their mastery, both of the environment and those in it, is not a gift from God, but something they must carve out of the earth with their own hands, step by bloody step. It is a reminder of the harsh reality. Prosperous as they may be, dignified as they may style themselves, their lives are on the frontier and must be defended with sword and musket. In the end, the 1622 massacre achieves the exact opposite of what the Indians wanted. Instead of driving the English away from their ancestral lands and into the sea, it anchors them more firmly to the soil of Virginia, soil for which they've now fought and bled many times. And they eradicate the Powhatan Confederacy. They go about seizing it. The 1622 rebellion is the forge. The settlers who survive it are no longer really Englishmen in America. They're becoming Virginians. They've seen their neighbors slaughtered at the breakfast. They've seen their towns burned to ash. They've responded with a ferocity that make their Cavalier descendants and forefathers proud. There'll be little more peace and no more real attempts at conversion and education. Just the war on the frontier as the civilization pushes everything west. Indian Gambit lost. Their world dies. Thanks for listening. I'll see you again next time with the next tale of the Virginia colony. This is The Old World with Will Tannen. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share this episode. Bye.